Using the live streaming menu options. Also, anyone joining us through our official conference website can raise questions and share comments through the website. There is a comment section under the live streaming tab in the website, and we encourage you to actively participate in Q&A and discussion by using this comment section to compose your questions and comments. The website also provides detailed information on this conference, including its programs, biography of speakers, and presentation materials for downloading. That's all for the housekeeping announcement, and we'll be moving down on the program for sessions 2 and 3. But first, allow us to replay the keynote speech from the earlier section for those participants who didn't have the chance to watch it. This keynote speech is delivered by Ms. Samira Asma, Assistant Director General for Data, Analytics, and Delivery at the World Health Organization, who is leading the WHO's effort to use timely, reliable, and actionable data in pursuing organizational and global agenda, including the SDGs. Please turn your attention to the video.
Hello, colleagues. I'm delighted to welcome you to the 2021 International Conference on Official Statistics. This conference comes at a pivotal moment, one where we have the chance to turn crisis into an opportunity if we act together with speed and at scale. And more importantly, to be better prepared when the next crisis strikes with real-time, reliable, and actionable data and country capacity to predict, detect, and respond to any health emergencies. COVID-19 has shown that inadequate data has hindered our ability to prepare and respond to health emergencies, not only at a global level, but at national and local levels as well. The pandemic is not the first crisis, nor will it be the last, and we must have the data and statistical systems that are agile, integrated, and responsive. To accurately and consistently report on the Sustainable Development Goals, every country requires several functioning data systems that must speak to one another, such as the household health surveys, census, CRVS, and administrative data, and so on. WHO recently conducted a global assessment of data and health information system capacity in countries. The report found that over 50% of countries lacked good capacity for surveillance, and only 27% have sustainable capacity to survey public health threats. It also found that 40% of deaths worldwide remain unregistered. So this begs a question: how can we prevent future emergencies if countries still cannot count deaths and report on causes of death? A recent study from the World Bank and the United Nations further showed that 65% of the National Statistical Organization headquarters are either partially or fully closed as a result of the pandemic, with 90% of staff working from home and 96% partially or fully refraining from in-person data collection. If governments don't know where vulnerable populations live, what people are dying from, how old they are, or what their health status is, it is truly impossible to deliver the right interventions, such as vaccines, to the right people at the right time, at the right place. It also means that inequalities that existed before COVID-19 are being exacerbated. A new WHO global dashboard on COVID-19 vaccine equity finds that low-income countries would add more than $38 billion to their 2021 GDP if they had the same vaccination rates as the high-income countries. So there is a big inequity gap that we see globally. Understanding precisely where the gaps are and how to address them requires access to and use of new data sources. In other words, it requires going beyond official statistics to strike the right balance between data sharing and protection and ensuring impartial, independent national statistical organizations that are integrated with all sectors, including health sector. As I often say, we should be able to check the latest health data the same way we check weather every morning. Data gaps and fragmentation are not new, but they are increasingly costly and threaten the lives and livelihoods of millions of people around the world. Today, on this occasion, I would like to highlight 3 lessons and promising solutions for how to address the issues that we are facing and get back on track towards the 2030 agenda. Not only get back on track, but accelerate our progress to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals. First, governments must invest in basic civil registration and vital statistics capacity at local and national level to count every birth and death in both health facilities and in the communities. WHO and UNICEF recently launched a joint guidance on the role of the health sector in making every birth and death count. The health sector is a critical ally of the national statistical organizations with a unique multi-sectoral network reaching to the community levels. A new CRVS strategic implementation plan for 2021 and 2025 has also been prepared to support countries in mobilizing their health sector to lead and contribute to the CRVS system strengthening, with several countries prioritized for the coming year. In addition, we recently hosted an expert consultation on WHO's new multi-mode, multi-topic, and multi-platform survey system, the World Health Survey Plus, which will provide much-needed solutions to bridge diverse data sources and adapt global tools to local contexts. National statistical organizations working together with ministries of health will play a key role in implementing the World Health Survey Plus and ensure these surveys are representative, low cost, and country owned. Another key lesson is the importance of investing in data infrastructure and digital technology. Routine information systems cannot be isolated from the wider national systems. In other words, health data must be able to talk to tax data, for example, or education, workforce data, and finance, and more. This is what we have termed national data infrastructure. And a key component of this is having a set of unique identifiers for individuals by space and location. At the World Health Organization, we are supporting these efforts through forums like the Health Data Collaborative and the SDG Global Action Plan, which works to align technical and financial resources with country needs. In addition, we recently hosted the first of the multi-series Health Data Governance Summit to address key challenges and share best practices to support the use of data as a global public health good. And we invite you all to join us for the next session on 30th of September. Finally, the third key lesson is the importance of public-private partnership. Working collaboratively with all sectors is so crucial to ensure data systems are integrated and interoperable and that solutions are implemented seamlessly. One example of this is WHO's partnership with Microsoft, Avanade, and Esri and many other technological companies to develop the new World Health Data Hub, an end-to-end digital destination for countries, partners, and all global health stakeholders to access and use real-time health data. The hub will increase the transparency and speed of data collection, monitor inequalities through disaggregated data, and enable the use of data to drive policy dialogue and impact in countries. Earlier this year, we released the results of the first use case for the hub. COVID-19 global excess mortality estimates were developed through a group of global experts to reflect both the direct and indirect impact of the pandemic on mortality. And our assessment indicated that 1.2 million more deaths occurred as a result of COVID in 2020 than officially reported. And we are now working with countries and partners on modeling and estimating nationally and plan to release these estimates by the end of this year. So we will have a better understanding of the true and the tragic human toll of the pandemic. My three key messages can be summarized with a call for all countries to move from national statistical systems to national statistical and data systems. This will ensure that we incorporate unconventional data sources, show bold leadership in bridging big data with citizen science, and use the power of machine learning and artificial intelligence to draw insights and respond effectively. While there is already a broad consensus, what is needed now is that we must urgently operationalize to leverage the potential of innovation and keep pace with the rapid changes to data ecosystem. This includes echoing our collective support for a new global data convention alongside the statement on data as truly a global public good, to instill confidence in data sharing, data protection, and use, and support our common goal of more timely, reliable, actionable, and accessible data for all. I and all colleagues at the World Health Organization are committed to closely working with you to promote health, keep the world safe, and serve the vulnerable in line with Dr. Tedros's vision to transform the World Health Organization into a truly modern, data-driven enterprise to serve all countries. Thank you so very much.
I thank Dr. Asma for her wonderful contribution and thank everyone for your attention. At this moment, I would like to invite you to watch this special video jointly produced by Korea Agency for Infrastructure Technology Advancement and the UNSD, demonstrating examples of using data to overcome COVID-19.
The entire world has encountered a crisis due to COVID-19. Moreover, the world is struggling to fight against the mutant viruses that continue to break out. We ought to prepare for not only COVID-19, but also other potential viruses that can arise in the future. We are required to refocus on the quarantine system again. Whenever a confirmed case of COVID-19 occurs, what epidemiological investigators do? Identify places visited by confirmed cases. Contact tracing. Identify potential sources of infection. Identifying areas at risk of infection and establishing quarantine measures takes a long time as the implementation must be done by humans. Since large-scale outbreaks lead to exponential increase in data processing load, more time and workforce are required. The more time it takes for epidemiological investigation and analyses, it is inevitable to see an increase in weaknesses in the quarantine measures against COVID-19. K-Quarantine Solution can handle problems that the existing quarantine measures cannot solve. It is a system developed in accordance with diverse overseas environment. Based on Korea's COVID-19 epidemiology investigation support system, which has been globally recognized for its excellence. The Korean Epidemiological Investigation Support System automatically presents where the confirmed patients have been and the areas at risk of infection within 10 minutes based on AI analyses. In addition, for a facility at risk of group infection, the QR code-based electronic registry system enables the quick identification of persons contacted by confirmed cases. People who self-quarantine can manage their health condition through the Safety Protection app and prevent further spread of diseases by safe self-isolation. K-Quarantine Solution can contribute to decreasing unnecessary wastes of time and workforce while establishing efficient quarantine policies. In addition, even if a large number of confirmed cases occurs, our capacity of analyzing the data of 100,000 people per day allows us to deter infectious disease and prevent proliferation of the virus by carrying out rapid epidemiological investigation. Our quick and efficient K-Quarantine Solution will support you in preventing and impeding the spread of COVID-19 and new infectious diseases. We hope that our K-Quarantine Solution will be able to quickly end COVID-19.
I hope you enjoy this video. The conference will resume shortly. Now, I'd like to invite you to session 2 by introducing the session chair, Ms. Kyung-sun Che. As Director of the International Cooperation Division at Statistics Korea, Ms. Che oversees COSTET's bilateral, multilateral, and regional cooperation, as well as its statistical development cooperation. She has over 30 years' experience in working for official statistics, including standards and methodological works. Ms. Che recently served as the first head of the Center of Excellence for Statistics on Crime and Criminal Justice in Asia and the Pacific, a joint establishment of COSTAT and the UNODC, providing support for countries in the region to improve their crime and criminal justice data. With that, let me invite Ms. Che to the stage.
Thank you, Amy. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Whatever time zone you are, welcome to the second session of the 2021 International Conference on Official Statistics. My name is Kyung-sun Choi, but you can call me Cass. I am the Director of the International Cooperation Division at COSTET. It is a great honor for me to moderate this session. Last year, when WHO designated the COVID-19 pandemic as
Good morning and good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I would like to thank the organizers of the conference to give me the opportunity to inform you about UNEC's important work on supporting NSOs and the national statistical systems in measuring hazardous events and disasters. Without any doubt, official statistics is crucial for fact-based management of any kind of disaster risk. And we can say that good statistics literally can help to save human lives. However, at the same time, we are aware of shortcomings in the data and the need to strengthen partnerships between producers of official statistics and agencies being in charge of disaster risk management. My name is Nagy and I work for the UNEC Statistical Division here in Geneva. It's an honor for me to present you now the Conference of European Statisticians' recommendations on the role of official statistics in measuring hazardous events and disasters. Already in 2015, the chief statisticians of our region identified an urgent need to review the fitness of official statistics for measuring hazardous events and disasters. This was triggered by a so-called in-depth review, which was led by Mexico in 2014. It concluded that it is important to clarify the role of national statistical offices in providing information on disasters and extreme events. And this was around the same time when our colleagues at ESCAP jumped onto the same train and established a working group to develop their disaster-related statistics framework. At UNEC, the Bureau of the Conference of European Statisticians decided to set up a task force with the following objectives: to clarify the role of official statistics, to identify practical steps how national statistical offices can support disaster management and risk reduction, to identify the main needs and data sources, and to identify needs for harmonization of classifications, terms and definitions. The task force was composed of experts of national statistical offices of several countries and several important international organizations which are being active in this area, and you can see the list of countries and organizations on this slide. Thanks to the excellent collaboration of national and international experts under the umbrella of the EC task force, and after a wide international consultation process, in June 2019, the Conference of European Statisticians adopted the recommendations. The recommendations now clarify the role of national statistical officers and the national statistical systems in providing information related to hazardous events and disasters within the existing institutional environment of countries. Even if the governance structures differ in countries, there are certain strengths that NSOs and national statistical systems have that are universal and therefore give national statistical offices and the statistical systems a natural specific place in the institutional environment related to disaster risk management of each country. The CS recommendations also identify practical steps to find this place and role in the institutional environment to better support disaster risk management efforts in close coordination with national agencies responsible for this in this area of work. In addition, the recommendations include 11 case studies from around the world which show different roles that NSOs have taken up in supporting national efforts to measure and manage disaster risk. You can download the recommendations from the link that is displayed here on this slide. The recommendations are structured in 8 main chapters, plus case studies and some annexes. In bold, I highlighted the substantive chapters, which I'm going to talk about a little bit more in the next few slides. Chapter 4 defines the scope and measurement framework, but here we are mainly referring to the work our friends at ESCAP have done with their expert group to draft one really important normative piece of work in this area, the ESCAP Disaster-Related Statistics Framework. With that reference, it also becomes clear that the CS recommendations are complementary with this disaster-related statistics framework. And even if both documents were drafted from a regional perspective, they are of global relevance. I will talk about chapters 5, the role of the national statistical systems, chapter 7, the recommendations, and chapter 8, the implementation in my next few slides. Before that, let me give you a quick overview on some selected, very interesting national examples that are included in this document. For example, Armenia provided a case study where they show what are the national information needs in this area and what is the concrete role the National Statistical Office has in the institutional environment, which also includes an emergency protocol that really defines the role of the National Statistical Office in case of a declared emergency. Italy provided an example how the National Statistical Institute is involved in integrating information from different sources for disaster risk management, and this project is called the Casa Italia. Mexico provided a similar case example about the role of the National Statistical Office, but with a specific focus on providing services for integration of geospatial information. Turkey gave the example on the scope of their national disaster statistics, and the United States provided this example about the US Census Bureau, which has tools that can quickly provide statistics in emergency situations. Let's talk about chapter 5, the role of national statistical systems in disaster risk management. This slide shows you in a very simplified way the so-called disaster risk management cycle, which can be divided into the following phases: the risk assessment, prevention and mitigation, preparedness, the time when a disaster strikes, meaning the emergency period, the response, the recovery, which then again feeds with information about previous disasters into risk assessment, and this way closes the cycle. In a much simpler way, we can say that there are 3 main phases: before, during, and after a disaster. And for each of these phases, national statistical systems have specific strengths that can support disaster risk management. So, for example, in the phases of risk assessment, prevention, and preparedness, national statistical systems can provide basic statistics from regular statistical production, for example, about population and infrastructure for risk assessment. It can produce and provide statistics on previous disasters and losses, but it also can help in the communication of this information and integrating it with data or information from other sources. In an emergency situation, the granularity of fact-based information is crucial. For example, in the case of an earthquake, it's essential to have numbers about the potentially affected population, their age groups, gender, and so on available. These statistics are really needed for immediate emergency response. Statistics are needed about critical infrastructure and so on. Or in the case of a drought or flood, statistics may be needed about potential impacts on agricultural production, the population at risk, and so on. So these examples demonstrate that it is key to have information without too long time lags available, but also that the information can be used for regional or for small scale analysis, meaning we need some geocoded information here. After a disaster, national statistical systems can contribute to the assessment of losses in physical and monetary terms, assess rebuilding efforts, and of course assure the proper communication of this information to the various partners and stakeholders. As in many other areas, the role of NSOs in coordinating international reporting is also crucial. NSOs can assure that data reported to international databases following internationally agreed frameworks and are coherent and consistent with the data used in the national disaster risk management. All in all, we can distinguish between core roles and additional roles that national statistical systems have. So core roles are those roles and tasks which represent typical strengths of national statistical offices and their NSS. And it's recommended that all NSOs and their statistical systems take up these tasks within the landscape of disaster risk management. The additional roles are those roles and tasks that NSOs could incorporate into their functions and responsibilities if there is not another organization already within the institutional environment taking up these tasks. So core roles include, for example, the provision of baseline data to produce statistics on exposure impacts, to support disaster risk management in producing and communication of information, to set up and enforce quality standards, and so on. It also includes, for example, the reporting efforts. Additional roles are very nicely described in some of the case studies that we have in the report. So, for example, it could be in the assist in the assessment of direct and indirect impacts. It could be maintaining collaborative sites for disaster attention, to develop and implement methodologies for risk assessment, or to provide services for linking of information from various sources. The chapter 7 of the document lists the most important obstacles NSOs and also international organizations which are in charge of producing or also using disaster-related statistics have to deal with. They include data gaps, timeliness, accessibility to the right users in the right time, interpretability of the information, statistical office operations and methods and standards. Based on experiences in other statistical areas and experiences of NSOs which have already implemented statistics on hazardous events and disasters, the CS recommendations explain in a few important steps that NSOs have to take to further develop existing statistics or to produce new information for improving the measurement of hazardous events and disasters. In conclusion, we can say that the CS recommendations have been developed in close collaboration with the SCAP expert group and are complementary with the disaster-related statistics framework. They help national statistical systems and disaster risk management agencies to collaborate and to clarify their roles and responsibilities. And they also provided useful guidance for managing the COVID-19 disaster with official statistics. As you may have noticed, the document was published a few months before COVID-19 was declared a pandemic. And what we could see from national statistical offices in our region is that the document really provided useful guidance for quickly finding the right role as an NSO under these new conditions and supporting COVID-19 related management with the needed information. The task force has a new mandate since 2019 and is now dealing with some issues that couldn't be tackled previously. So now we are working on more practical implementation guidelines. We support the statistical operationalization of terms, definitions, and classifications used in disaster risk management. For example, currently we are doing a statistical review of the revised hazard classification that has been developed under UNDRR. The development of a set of core statistics and indicators which is recommended to be implemented by all NSOs in our region, and also in close collaboration with the Interagency and Expert Group on Disaster-Related Statistics, we organized in June the first global expert forum for producers and users of disaster-related statistics. I hope this presentation created some interest in downloading, reading, and using this very useful piece of work. I would like to thank again all members of our task force who contributed to the success of this document, and I would like to thank now all of you for listening to my presentation. If you have any questions or comments, you can also contact me by email. Thank you very much, and goodbye.
Thank you, Michael, for painting a big picture on the role of official statistics. Due to some technical issue, I couldn't introduce you properly, so I will do that now. Mr. Nagy is a statistician at the UNEC, where he is responsible for environment statistics, SEEA, and disaster-related statistics. Before joining the UNEC, he was head of the section on environment statistics of Qatar Statistics Authority. Michael also worked at the Austrian Environment Agency as an expert for water management, environment statistics, environmental economic accounting, and management of environmental information. Sorry, Michael. And now let's move on to our second speaker, Mr. Andrew Kruskiewicz. Mr. Kruskiewicz is a senior researcher and faculty lecturer at Columbia University. He is also science advisor for the Red Crescent Climate Center. He is interested in exploring how to best communicate uncertainty found within climate and weather impact-based projections and focus to decision makers in humanitarian sector. His work includes the development of climate services for complex socio-economic contexts such as conflict, refuge, and displacement settings. Andrew, the floor is yours.
Hello, thank you very much for the introduction. Thank you to the organizers. Thank you, Chair. Just to confirm, could everybody hear me clearly? Excellent, thank you. So, yes, my presentation today will be titled Integrating Data and Statistics into Humanitarian Anticipatory Action. I am a scientist, so this is going to be me sharing experiences from a scientist research perspective, but I will start off by saying, yes, while I am based at a university, I do advise for the Red Cross and other humanitarian organizations. So I'm in a privileged position between science research and also in applying that science to decision-making, policy development in these other applications. So yeah, thank you very much. And I'm happy to share some ideas on how we understand the past to improve preparedness, resilience, and response in the future. So actually, I was thinking, I was searching for some quotes, or thinking of some quotes about that concept of what is the importance of understanding the past history in order to inform the future. And I was surprised because I did not come across anything that I found extra appealing to share specific to disasters. And this isn't, on one hand, it's not a surprise. I mean, disasters are kind of a hybrid field, let's say, where it's an integration of geophysical sciences, social science, socioeconomic perspectives to come up with the mix that makes a disaster. So many times it's not a theme that's central to many discussions. However, on the other hand, it is a way that many of us are experiencing global change. So I think that's also something to note throughout this talk. Disasters are an important element to focus on, and increasingly so when we're thinking about which data is important, which type of historical data is important in order for us better to understand the present and also the future. So the objectives of this talk are as follows. Understanding elements of climate data and forecasts. That's my background as a meteorologist. First and foremost, I will share a couple of points. And then moving on to integrating climate data into decision making and the importance of statistics and quality, understanding quality of statistics with two examples. One in Bangladesh with the Rohingya refugee camp, and then in Ecuador, looking at flash flood risk. And then moving on to some ideas on next steps. How do we improve disaster statistics in thinking about specific themes of disaggregation of subtype of disasters, talking about compound disasters and ensuring they're appropriately captured, and then also capacity building to ensure quality control. So this image here, I want to start with. To me, this is a powerful image. This is the average number of stations reporting per year in Rwanda. So I'm wondering if some of you can look at this and see that there is a gap. On the x-axis, we see years from 1981 onwards, and on the y-axis going up, we see 0 up to 120. Those are the number of stations, and we see a gap for approximately 93, 94 onwards. This is a period of conflict in Ethiopia, and you could see that the amount of data that we have from weather stations declines drastically and only starts to increase later on. So what do we do as meteorologists? We still, actually one could argue this is the most important time to have a quality understanding of what's going on with climate and disaster risk. So I'm going to move on to another country. This is Ethiopia here. And a similar idea is that if we just have station data, and this could range from a few stations to some number, if we're looking at rainfall, this is what the map could look like. And we see some artifacts here in the representation of the data. And it could be difficult to get a sense of what's happening if we're looking at precipitation alone, from stations alone, rather. So what do we do? Well, fortunately, we're able to integrate satellite estimates with the station data. So if we have the station data on the left, and then we have satellite data, we can blend them together with different algorithms and come up with some sort of hybrid approach for mixing station data, satellite data, and coming up with different ways to represent the data. Without getting into details, these are methods that we're able to do in different countries to varying degrees of success. And understanding the constraints of this process are a very important aspect of understanding disaster risk and is a key component in order to get a sense of what degree of confidence we have in understanding the climate element of disaster risk. Moving on to a little bit more about forecasting and prediction, I wanted to share this chart quickly. And on the x-axis on the bottom, we have forecast lead time, and on the y-axis, forecast skill. And this map is designed to share the concept of different timescales of weather forecasting. If we start at the origin at 0, 0, that is when we're talking about short-term forecasts or weather forecasts. We could see at just a couple of days out, the forecast skill is excellent. And then if we're using weather forecasts, it declines, the skill declines as we move out to longer lead time. Then we also have sub-seasonal forecasts. This is actually experimental types of forecasts that we're trying to improve. But these go from approximately 25 days to 55 days. And we could see that the peak skill here is not so good, but we do see a decline to 0 skill as we move out. And then we have seasonal forecasts as well, starting at about 40, 50 days outwards to a few months. We could see that this skill is fair and then gradually declines. So what's the story here? Well, I wanted to identify some areas of skill. So if we say, okay, 10-day lead time for weather forecasts, skill is approximately poor to fair. And then if we look at the corresponding lead time at different forecasts, we could say, okay, well, seasonal forecasts, we also have that level of skill. How could that be? How could 10 days and 120 days have a similar level of forecast skill? Well, and one of the answers is that first, these are different ways to forecast the climate space. But one of the reasons why we're able to do this is because we have improved the way of integrating observations, but also because we have increasingly strong statistics on not only what the climate element of disaster risk has happened, but also on the impact side. So we need both. And the takeaway here is there are different lead times that we need to be sensitive to. So this is one of this case study. We're going to move into Bangladesh. This is a picture of the Rohingya refugee camp. So a few years ago, there was a movement of population from Myanmar to Bangladesh, and there were approximately 700,000 refugees, and decisions had to be made about which types of disaster risk should be prioritized in the camp management process. My team and I were called in and asked to support questions such as where can floods occur, what types of floods occur, where can landslides occur. But in thinking about which data and which statistics was used integrated into the decision-making process, there was various levels of governance and official and non-official statistics that were being part of the discussion. And this was something that for me as a scientist, taking a step back and saying, okay, what are the roles and responsibilities in understanding what official statistics means in this context, and also what is the responsibility to be aware of regional and global data that could or could not be also useful when integrated into the decision-making process. And one of the challenges was there was a lot of data. This was not a context where there was gaps in data. There was a lot, and some could argue that there was too much data at different times of trying to prioritize. And the question was non-trivial, because on one hand, we could say, okay, if there are 700,000 refugees in Kutupalong, which is the largest camp in Cox's Bazar, Bangladesh, then everybody is vulnerable. But one of the unique elements here in most refugee camps is how do you prioritize the most vulnerable when everyone is considered the most vulnerable population? And this was an extremely complex question that we tried to address with different types of data. Which is the best and which do we trust are two of the questions that came up in working with the intersector coordination group in the refugee camp. And these are questions that stick with me and propagate through the rest of my work since this. And it's not easy. The takeaway is that it's not easy sometimes to understand the answers to these questions, and sometimes it's impossible. So what did we do? So on the right here, you'll see there is a document that we produced with our colleagues in the refugee camp. This is available and I could send it around to you, but it's talking about, yes, exactly these sorts of questions in the refugee context. And on the left is a tool that we developed called a decision-making flowchart. And this was something new to me as a quantitative scientist thinker. It was one of the first times that I worked with decision makers to map out the ideas. And I want to direct everyone's attention to the top three boxes in this flowchart, 6A, 6B, 6C, but this spoke directly to the importance of understanding which data is available, which data is official, and to what extent the data has different levels of quality. So it's really complex, but this is also a process that we're able to share. So just quickly, I'm going to share an existing project that I'm leading as principal investigator. It's a NASA-funded project, sponsored also by GEO, the Group on Earth Observations. But it's looking to better understand flash flood risk in Ecuador, in moving towards developing an anticipatory action plan we call forecast-based financing within the Red Cross, Red Crescent context. But again, this was another scenario where understanding which are the official data sets and trying to get a sense of what is the level of subtype disaggregation in which flood reports are available. I know we don't have too much time yet, so I don't want to unpack this too much. The main takeaway here is that, yes, Ecuador is a place where there's different types of floods that occur in different parts of the country. We have riverine floods and flash floods are the predominant types. However, while we had historical data coming from official sources, in many cases, the official sources did not disaggregate by flood type. So why is this a problem? Well, from a humanitarian context, if we're developing early action protocols which speak to the anticipatory action standard operating procedures of a humanitarian group such as Ecuador Red Cross, the type of flood is very important because based on the type of flood, not only will the response and the recovery actions differ, but also the anticipatory actions will differ as well. So we we published a paper on this, which is basically working with Ecuador Red Cross to assign a subtype to the existing flood historical data. And this is something that I think is one of the key takeaways of my presentation, is that it is important to understand which level of disaggregation is present when we're looking at historical disaster data, especially with floods. This is some of our processes on the top left. This is just a flow chart from identifying disaster data sets and then flowing down to a metric we call FFCI, which is a flash flood confidence interval, which was a value that we assigned to each report labeled only as flood, a degree of confidence that we thought a specific flood was a flash flood or not. On the right was part of the keywords that we integrated to this process. And then in the bottom are some of the data sets. Desinventar SNGRE is the official disaster database of Ecuador, and then a derived data set with 3,361 events. So this is, again, an example of a case study of bringing some of these ideas into action. And this is the result of the FFSI flash flood confidence index here. So without going through, this was an example that I wanted to share with the group, but I think we're running a bit short on time. I wanted to show this because that step of better understanding what type of subtype of flood we have in the historical record is important because it allows us to train our flash flood risk model, which in turn will allow us to improve flash flood anticipatory action in a humanitarian context, which will lead us to develop early action protocols. Here, I was demonstrating the Ecuador context to early action protocol development in Mongolia, which is another example of working with official statistics. But I will step aside or move towards, first, of course, thanks to the team that was working on this. I have to give my team, awesome team, a shout out. But then leaving it here on the last steps, just to go through the conclusion a bit. So where do I see some opportunities? Ensuring compound disasters are appropriately captured. This is a challenge for us in the research and implementation side. Knowing if the disaster data set is disaggregated by subtype. Improving monitoring and evaluation. This is something that this disaggregation step will also lead towards. And then, yes, enhance engagement with the anticipatory action community. I'm very glad to hear talk about governance structures and collaboration, but something specific and also a growing community, such as the Risk Informed Early Action Partnership and Anticipation Hub, are two organizations that will be interested in engaging within the nexus of National Statistics Office, humanitarian organizations, academia, and also National Meteorological and Hydrological Services. So at the bottom right, you can see the best email to contact me at if there's any questions. But again, thanks to the organizers and to the chair. And that's all from my side. Thank you very much. Over.
Thank you, Andrew, for the very informative and interesting presentation about the climate data and steps to improve disaster statistics. Now let's move on to our next presenter, which is Mark Salden. Mr. Salden is government statistician and chief executive of Statistics New Zealand. He leads the country's primary data and statistics agency and is the government's principal advisor on statistical matters. He is responsible for how and when to produce statistics and authorize the publication of data and statistics. He also takes on the role of government chief data steward, supporting the government to realize the potential of data. Mark's presentation is on video. Please play the video.
Tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. It's a real pleasure to be here today, and so thank you very much to the organisers of this really important conference for inviting me along. My name is Mark Salden, and I'm the Government Statistician and Chief Executive of Stats New Zealand, or Statistics New Zealand, New Zealand's National Statistics Agency. The subject of this conference, and indeed this session, couldn't be more topical for me. Right here in New Zealand, thanks to the appearance of the Delta strain in our community, we're in the midst of a full national lockdown, which is why I'm recording this intervention from my library, and why I'm going to keep my remarks today fairly brief. For most of us in New Zealand, this is actually the first time we've been in this lockdown position since March to May last year. But it does all feel really rather familiar, and we can only hope that it has the same effect as last year, which is that we stamp out the virus and can get out of lockdown fairly quickly. And just like last year, integrated data is once again underpinning much of the modelling effort that goes into the government's response planning and decision making. So the topic of this session couldn't be more apt. For those of you who are unaware, New Zealand has a relatively mature integrated data system, which has come to inform and underpin a significant amount of government policy. And as I will come to, it was instrumental to many of the efforts that led to New Zealand's response to the COVID-19 pandemic last time, and indeed again this time. In fact, for the last quarter of a century, we've been on a journey to leverage the wider benefit from data underpinning New Zealand's official statistics system, with a particular focus on data integration. And that's certainly a focus for our organisation going forward, as I'll talk about at the end of this presentation. But today we operate two integrated databases containing de-identified longitudinal microdata. Our integrated data infrastructure, or IDI, contains data about people, while our longitudinal business database, or LBD, contains data about businesses. I won't dwell too much on the detail here. I'll just note that for anyone interested, that the IDI is built around a central linking spine that all other data sets are then linked to. The IDI spine is created by linking births, tax records and migration data to create what we call an ever-resident population. Once the spine has been created, the remaining data sources are then linked to the spine on a one-to-one basis. Now, historically, our integrated data program has been operated as a research tool used to understand complex social and economic issues in depth. But this somewhat academic focus is beginning to change, particularly in the wake of COVID-19. So let's talk about that for a moment. Last year, at the beginning of the pandemic, researchers from the University of Auckland undertook a research project using the IDI, where they built an individual-based network that is representative of the New Zealand population, including schools, workplaces, family structure, community groups, and movements between and within cities. This network model was then used as the basis to run a detailed complex contagion model, including spatial and occupational effects for the COVID pandemic under different scenarios. This project was, the outputs of this project were regularly submitted to the data from the data lab directly to the National Crisis Management Centre that managed our response. And the models garnered a high degree of media interest and indeed political interest, with one of the project leads, Professor Sean Hendy, regularly speaking to the media about their finding, and those findings were very instrumental in the government's response to COVID as well. And with the return of COVID to New Zealand, since last week, Professor Hendy's team have been back at work in the IDI and LBD to model the potential consequences of our current data outbreak and the steps we're taking to address it. Of course, it's fantastic to see the IDI being used in this way and having such a positive output. But the IDI is rather an unsung hero in New Zealand's COVID-19 response. While the modelling work has been rightly applauded, few people will be fully aware of how fortunate we are to have a world-leading integrated data platform at our disposal. And beyond COVID, there are many other emerging use cases where the statistical outputs from IDI are being used to directly allocate resources and design policy. For example, our Ministry of Social Development uses the IDI to build and develop their social outcomes model. This is a detailed model that helps policymakers understand current needs and how they may change in the future, so they can ensure the right support is reaching the right people and funding is effectively distributed across support services. The project requires linked data for a broad range of factors that covers the whole population, and the IDI is the only place where this is available. But while the IDI has become an integral component in the decision-making process of central government, it has remained a largely invisible one. In fact, you might say the IDI is a victim of its own creeping success, moving incrementally from somewhat humble beginnings to being a critical part of government decision-making and policy development with little or no fanfare. So what we're now trying to do is translate all of that good work into a better understanding of the value of integrated data to New Zealand. Our challenge going forward is to elevate the profile of the IDI by partnering with different agencies and expanding our customer base. And we need to be clearer on the breadth of value derived from the IDI And we need to get better at communicating that and encouraging others to support it. So with that in mind, I want to leave you with a few pointers, because while we view the integrated data program as a huge success, we have learned a lot of lessons along the way. And these are things that should be of interest to anyone working in integrated data. Firstly, start with a use case and let it grow. Many projects in government and elsewhere start as good ideas, but then fail to deliver the intended value. There are many reasons for this, but often it's because the scope gradually creeps to be larger and larger, eventually becoming a solution to all organisational problems. And that situation ultimately dilutes the value you get by sticking to a defined targeted scope. So I'd really encourage you to do that as you start. For example, we started with a really simple use case to understand the relationships between education and training and labour market outcomes. And not only did this provide immediate benefit and constrain the scope, it also allowed supplier agencies to build confidence in the linking process by trying things first. Second lesson is thinking about future users up front and designing the infrastructure accordingly. So notwithstanding my advice to start small, always start with an eye to the future. So in our experience, allowing the program to grow organically from a series of use cases can create problems downstream. In our own case, we now have a highly utilised system that is still largely designed as a prototype, so we've built on that original prototype. The infrastructure investment has not kept pace with the growth in utilisation, and a major reinvestment in the underpinning process and technology is required. Had we foreseen that growing level of demand, we may have found it easier to plan for the funding required to keep up with it, and may have thought about the design earlier in the process. My third lesson is a clear authorising environment really matters, and a ministerial champion makes that even better. So when we first introduced the IDI, we benefited from the political support of the government of the day, which helped some government chief executives be less risk-averse about putting their data in the IDI. Without this support, we might not have been able to progress as fast as we did, and we may not have reached our current state of maturity at all. So having a ministerial or political champion gives government departments an understanding of why cross-agency linkage is important, and also helps them form a plan of how and when they could make that happen. Fourth takeout is that safe integration requires a strong regulatory environment. So appropriate legislation is a critical enabler for successful data integration. New Zealand's Statistics Act from 1975, for example, which is still our governing legislation, enables anonymised data to be used for bona fide research if the government statistician, that's the person in my position, is satisfied that the research has the necessary knowledge, experience and skills to use that data. And likewise, our Privacy Act enables the use of information within a framework that protects New Zealanders' privacy. Having said all of that, we're now in the process of modernising our legislative framework, with new legislation expected to be introduced in the coming weeks. Back in 1975, there was little or no digitisation of personal information, as you can imagine. And believe it or not, there's not actually a single reference to the word data contained in our Act. So our new data and statistics legislation will modernise the language used and address some of the key inefficiencies and barriers to effective integration. One of the key proposals in the new legislation is to enable the government statistician to require the collection of information from other agencies for statistical purposes, even if that information is not required for the operations of the agency itself. So that's about giving us more powers to increase the amount of data that we can put in the integrated data infrastructure. My next lesson would be transparent and consistent about how the rules are applied, but also be prepared to adapt those to changing circumstances. So the success of any integrated data program rests and falls on trust. The data suppliers, and indeed New Zealanders as a whole whose data it is, need to know that the data will not be used in a way that could compromise their operations or in contravention of their legislation or in contravention of what New Zealanders would be happy with or how they would be happy having their data used. To maintain this trust, we have a very clear set of rules that govern access to and use of the IDI, and we're careful to hold all users to the same standard, including our own internal use when our own internal users access the IDI. And we have two frameworks to ensure that we do this. The first is known as the 5 Safes framework. All applicants and their proposed research must meet these 5 safe conditions before access to the IDI is granted. So we have safe people, which means that we actually vet the researchers that are using the data, the researchers themselves. We have safe projects as the second one, so that's we look at each individual research project to ensure it's consistent with the spirit of access to integrated data. We have safe settings, which means that we make sure that the settings, or the physical settings in which the researchers access the data have meet certain security requirements. We have safe data, which means that actually the data we make sure that the data is what's necessary for the project and nothing more. And safe output, which means that we vet the output to make sure that no individual can be identified from the use of that output. So that's the 5 safes framework. We also have a second framework called Ngā Tikanga Paihiri, and that provides particular guidance on how data about Māori, New Zealand's indigenous population, and other underrepresented populations, how that data is used for research purposes. But it's worth noting that these frameworks were not in place from the outset. Rather, they evolved over time as the uses have changed and the trust relationships with researchers have developed, and New Zealanders' views about what's appropriate has changed over time as well. My next suggestion is remember that data quality is a shared responsibility. So data quality is an ongoing issue for us, but it has improved over time. Expectations around data quality have matured over time, but upstream accountability for data quality should be made clear with the data suppliers up front. It's their responsibility. In our experience, the best way to get agencies interested in improving their data quality is to stimulate them into becoming users of their own data. That certainly worked well for us. And my final lesson is try to maintain an active network of analysts. So researchers who came into the IDI environment, who deeply understood the vagaries of data from their own field, like health, quickly realised that data from other fields, such as the labour market, were just as idiosyncratic. So they realised that they needed to share knowledge across disciplines, and that those who collaborated tend to produce higher quality research. Recognising this collaborative process, we've worked to create a user community around the IDI, which we call the Data Lab Community Group. This involves an active mailing list, user forums and an online community where researchers can discuss their research and share code. The idea being that by creating such a community, we actively drive up the quality of research outputs from the IDI, thereby increasing its overall value. As I said at the beginning, we're very much looking at the future and how we can use IDI in the future. So I want to end by looking at that future. So here at STATS, we are working towards a world where most of the data we work with comes from administrative data sources. That is the data that government agencies collect for operational purposes. We will in fact endeavour to become an administrative data first organisation, and will work to ensure that the key infrastructure requirements like the IDI and LBD, the resources and system assets are all in place to make this transition. That will mean that existing data increases in efficiency and value and potential, and we will be able to focus our resources on areas that need support to ensure that all official data is representative of and reflective of New Zealand. This priority links closely with our aspirations for the data system. That is to build a robust foundation for working with administrative data. The way we work with all data providers must be collaborative and effective. You can see then that how our integrated data program, coupled with a significant increase in the volume of administrative data, has the potential to offer even deeper, more meaningful insights in an increasingly data-driven world. Thank you very much for listening. I'm so sorry that I can't join you for the remainder of the session, but I hope you enjoy the ongoing discussion and the rest of the conference. And I, of course, wish you well with your work on integrated data. Nō reira, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. Thank you.
Thank you. Although I didn't understand what you last said, thanks for sharing the valuable lessons you learned from your experience with the integrated data infrastructure. Let's move on to our fourth speaker, Ms. Aina Satra. Ms. Satra is a Senior Statistics Coordination Officer at the Demographic and Statistics section of the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees. One of her main functions is to lead and coordinate the work of the Global Expert Group on Refugee and Internally Displaced People Statistics. She also worked for UNAIDS regional support teams in Bangkok and Dalat, as well as at the global level. Please welcome Aina on video, but she is with us today, so please leave questions and comments on the chat box. Aina.
Thank you so much for inviting UNHCR to this conference. My name is Aina Satra. I'm the Senior Statistics Coordination Officer in UNHCR, but I'm also the coordinator of the Expert Group on Refugee and IDP Statistics, EGRIS. I'm going to present under the heading the role of improved official statistics on refugee, IDP, and stateless populations to reduce risk and build resilience. But before moving to my presentation, I just wanted to draw your attention to the photo I've included in the PowerPoint. This is from Mozambique. It's showing internally displaced families recovering from the recent flooding in March in the country. Refugee and internally displaced people, also known under the abbreviation IDPs, and stateless are on the front lines of the climate emergency. We know that many of them are living in hotspots where they typically lack resources to effectively adapt to increasingly hostile environment. Disasters linked to hazards may both trigger displacement and worsen living conditions or expose forcibly displaced populations to secondary displacement. It could also reduce chances of being able to return to their home where they originally were displaced from. The Internally Displaced Monitoring Center have recently launched a report, and according to this report, at the end of 2020, there were about 7 million internally displaced people as a result of disaster. The Global Compact on Refugees, where UNHCR is also a major player, recognizes that climate, environmental degradation, and disaster increasingly interact with the drivers of refugee movements. I'm going to continue and read sort of a paragraph from the Sendai framework for disaster risk reduction. And it says as follows: disaster risk reduction requires a multi-hazard approach and inclusive risk-informed decision-making based on the open exchange and dissemination of disaggregated data, including by sex, age, and disability, as well as an easily accessible, up-to-date, comprehensible, science-based, non-sensitive risk information complemented by traditional knowledge. We also know that improved official statistics on refugees, IDPs, and stateless persons are critical to plan and reduce disaster risk, especially in order to protect these populations and strengthen their resilience in very difficult circumstances. Official statistics on forcibly displaced persons are also crucial to understand disaster risk for these populations, strengthening disaster risk governance and enhancing the preparedness for an effective response. Also, taking a quote from the World Bank and from this year, 2021, where they say, the better we understand what drives the differentiated outcomes of disaster impacts for different populations, the better policies and interventions can be tailored to strengthen resilience for all. So based on this background and a background very much talking to the theme of this conference, the expert group on refugee and IDP statistics were established, really to improve statistics on these vulnerable groups that are often especially at risk when it comes to disaster or natural disaster. So just to give you a little bit of background to the group, the expert group was established in 2016. It has its mandate from the UN Statistical Commission. It was originally mandated to develop international recommendations on refugee statistics and a technical report on the statistics of IDPs, outlining the current status of IDP statistics. Then the mandate was extended in March 2018 to also building on the technical report on IDP statistics, but develop recommendations in the same area, as well as a compiler's manual with more hands-on and concrete technical guidance. The mandate was further extended in 2020 to also move into implementation of the recommendations and capacity building with a special focus on national level and in line with requests and needs identified at national level. The expert group has also been instrumental in making sure that we today also have forcibly displaced reflected in the SDG framework with an independent indicator. At the moment, the group is continue working on implementation of the recommendations on refugees and IDPs, but it's at the same time working on international recommendations on statelessness statistics. Just to give you a little bit of an overview of the outreach of the group, these are the members of the group colored in blue. We have 45 country members and 25 regional and international organizations as part of IGRIS. And after a review of the steering group, we also extended the steering committee to include all the countries you see here. So we have both steering committee members from the member states, but also from regional level and from international level. I'm not going to go into all of them, but we can share the presentation after if there is interest. So what did the group produce? Just quickly on the two main outcomes of the group, It's the recommendations on refugee statistics and the recommendations on IDP statistics. Both recommendations include a statistical framework, standardizations related to terminology, definitions, and classification. We have also a recommended list of basic data tabulations and indicators. There is a quite extensive assessment of data sources in relation to the production of forced displacement statistics, covering both admin data, censuses, and surveys, and also recommendations on how to improve them in this context. We've included identification of socioeconomic indicators for refugee integration and well-being, and also around measurement of progress towards durable solutions and key displacement-related vulnerabilities, especially related to IDPs. We have a list of recommended SDG indicators to be disaggregated by forced displacement. And we also have a chapter where we look at coordination and how to more effectively coordinate these efforts, both at national, regional, and international level. So quite comprehensive. And these two documents are available online. So we will be able to share the link to those if there is an interest. So what now? At this stage, we're really about implementation. We have the recommendations. As I said earlier, we're still working on recommendations on statelessness statistics, but for refugees and IDPs, we have the recommendations. And we as IGRIS are now looking at how to organize our work. We have three different working groups focusing on three different areas. You see them here, one around the whole dissemination, promotion, as well as advocacy work. We have one around building capacity and also technical support. And we have one around more lessons learned and working on the hands-on compilers manual guidance. And this visual here is showing a bit how we're thinking the process. We see the dissemination work, we see the work on the compilers manual, we see the strengthening around statistics capacity, and also the whole work around technical support, improving availability of official statistics on forcibly displaced persons. We also see that, again, leading to improved evidence-based policy and targeted development programs, which is really why we think this work is important, that it should eventually be reflected in policies and also in how projects and development work is moving forward. Of course, it's also important to capture the lessons that we learn in the implementation and also from countries when they implement this work. We also think that the whole peer-to-peer exchange in the expert group between the 45 country members is important, but also between countries that are taking on the IGRIS recommendations in different regions, learning from each other's best practices are being shared with countries that are less advanced in the implementations. All this is then feeding back into refinements of the recommendations. We have them approved, they are available, but we also recognize that work now undertaken as part of the implementation will feed into a potential update of the recommendations as we go forward, as well as work on the compiler's manual that we see more as a living document that has that hands-on guidance. So a circular process as you see from here. We work very closely with regional, statistical and political intergovernmental bodies. And we see that as crucial in taking the work forward, both at regional level and at national level. So going a little bit back to what I mentioned in my previous slide, this is how we have divided up the work. I'm not going to go too much into details on this, but maybe go to the next slide where you see more in details where we are doing work at present. As you can see, we have as a very wide outreach. As said, we also have members from all regions in the world, but we also have ongoing work in many of the regions. In some regions, more hands-on technical support to countries implementing the work. In other regions, we're working more at regional level, doing webinars and workshop, creating more visibility, but also understanding of the work. And then in other regions, again, we are engaging on the development of trainings and learning material. So that was my presentation and a snapshot into what the IGRIS is working on and also has produced. And feel free to reach out to the IGRIS Secretariat if there is need for more information. And I'm looking very much forward to the questions and also this discussion later on, and good luck with the rest of the conference. Thank you.
Thank you, Aina, for enlightening us about the role of official statistics to measure disaster impacts on different populations for better life policies for all. Our last speaker is Mr. Imam Mahdi. Mr. Mahdi is Deputy Chief Statistician for Methodology and Statistical Information of Statistics Indonesia, BPS. Prior to this, he served as Assistant Deputy for E-Government Policy, the Ministry of Administrative and Bureaucratic Reform, as well as Data Center Manager and IT Manager of the BPS. Please welcome Imam.
Okay, thank you, Ms. Kes, for giving me a floor. I would like to introduce myself. My name is Imam Mahdi, the Deputy Chief Statistician for Methodology and Statistical Information, BPS Statistics Indonesia. In this great opportunity, I'm going to talk about our initiatives. It is called the Indonesia One Disaster Data, and I will emphasize more on data integrations for disaster-related statistics. Ladies and gentlemen, as you know that Indonesia is located in a disaster-prone area and almost all types of disaster occur in Indonesia. In the last 5 years, there were recorded like more than 17,000 disaster occurrences in Indonesia. That's why disaster risk management is one of the national priorities in our national development planning. With such a great attention toward disaster management, the support for the provisions of disaster-related statistics is urgently needed. One of the goals that we want to achieve is to establish the Disaster Data Reference Center, where all disaster-related data from 34 government agencies reside in for the purpose of supporting disaster reduction decision-making and policy on disaster management, harmonization of disaster data, and also data transparency to the public. Based on the disaster-related statistic framework, the RSF, designed by UNESCO, we need to build the concept of data integration policy that mainly covers two parts. The first part we call the variables indicators. We need to identify and analyze what kind of variables and indicators are really needed to support the policy and decision-making on disaster management. And the second part, it's about the specification of standard data, metadata, reference code that is used, and also interoperability that are applied to all variables and indicators. By looking at the current condition, the issues of the data fragmentation, data standardizations, and common data platforms still remain nowadays. Most of the government agencies keep their own data. They define their own data concept and standard, and also currently they face difficulty of sharing or exchanging data among government agencies due to mainly different interests and silo data governance. In order to fix these issues, the government of Indonesia now has initiated the Indonesia One Data Policy that aims to improve national data governance and to support decision and policy making for national development. The establishment of the National Data Forum, it is considered very essential for coordination to all government agencies in order to set up data priority and data development plan, and also to resolve data issue among government agencies. By adopting the Indonesia One Data Policy scheme, we could focus specifically on the one disaster data and what strategy to implement the disaster data integration for the purpose of establishing the Disaster Data Reference Center. The first strategy is to strengthen data governance on disaster data. Among all government agencies and local governments that are related to disaster, the National Agency for Disaster Management is the leading agency as the disaster data custodian, since its main task of this agency is to provide national policy for disaster management, to build the vision and common objectives of disaster management, and also to coordinate the collection and acquisition of disaster-related data. Other government agencies play roles as the data producers, whose main task is to produce disaster-related data. The way they produce data should aim at the same vision, the same objectives, policy directions, and also technical implementation on the data principles. Meanwhile, in this context, BPS Statistics Indonesia as the NSO has the important role of conducting data capacity building for government agencies by providing guidelines for standard data, metadata, reference codes, and interoperability, also assisting data quality assurance, providing various statistical training programs, and harmonizing the disaster data from different data producers. And the second strategy is to implement data principles. Government agencies as the data producers shall implement data standard, metadata, reference codes, and interoperability on their disaster data. The implementation of data principles will help data harmonization to build the concept and definition of disaster data, and also to perform data exchange among government agencies. And lastly, the third strategy is to develop a common data platform, which is implemented in the Disaster Data Reference Center for integrating all disaster data into centralized database. The common data platform is used as a means of data exchange and synchronization from different data producers to the Disaster Data Reference Center and vice versa. In addition, we could perform data analytic, data visualization, and data exploration through the platform. Once all disaster-related data collected in the Disaster Data Reference Center, BPS Statistics Indonesia is conveniently able to produce disaster-related statistics by accessing the reference center through the data platform. BPS Statistics Indonesia, along with the National Agency for Disaster Management, takes the initiatives to develop the Indonesia One Disaster Data. The framework and guidebook of the Indonesia One Disaster Data have been devised as the guidelines for government agencies to implement. In addition, we also develop disaster indicators and their metadata to show the concept of disaster-related statistics, which can be used for policy and decision-making. We do hope that the guidance indicator examples will help the government agencies to understand the importance of these disaster-related statistics and how they could implement data principles on their own data. Furthermore, BPS Statistics Indonesia develops a dashboard as a prototype of showing indicators, including their metadata, data concept and definitions over a geospatial map. At this stage, we use statistical data from different sources, such as household survey, socioeconomic survey, and village potency survey to produce disaster indicators. Besides, BPS Statistics Indonesia develops Indonesia Data Hub that perform as data integration platform, which basically performs data orchestration from different data sources. The platform facilitates data explorations, visualizations, and delivery, and also data ontology. This showcase in the form of dashboard applications is expected to deliver the values of disaster-related statistics that can be perceived easily by other government agencies. The next thing to do is to conduct capacity building for the government agencies in order to accelerate the implementation of the Indonesia One Disaster Data and the development of the Disaster Data Reference Center. In the future, we try to strengthen governance and the disaster-related statistics framework as our guidance in managing processes and how disaster data is interconnected at regional, national, and global levels. Leaderships and commitment are, of course, very crucial, needed to support the coordination process in releasing Indonesia One Disaster Data among government agencies, so that it can produce useful information for policy and decision making. We keep moving forward through various pilot and capacity building activities, doing benchmarking and technical cooperation at the international level in accordance with the global standard and classification of disaster and hazard. That's all my talk today, and thank you very much for all your kind attention.
Thank you very much, Imam, for sharing your national example of integrating disaster data to support disaster reduction decision making. Now it's time for discussion. I will give you for each speaker question, and if we have time, we'll have some common questions. For Michael, the recommendation was published early last year. I think it was very timely. What I'm curious is that how it was being used by countries during the pandemic. Michael.
Yeah, thank you for the question. It's a bit difficult to answer because, of course, we do not know what the use exactly is, how many countries are actually following the recommendations directly. But what you could see is that we were giving the right recommendations, because what we did when the pandemic started, like many other international organizations, we tried to support national statistical offices in their efforts to provide the right information that was needed for managing the COVID-19 pandemic under very difficult circumstances. And one thing that we did actually two things very quickly. One was setting up a webinar where statistical offices had a chance to exchange experience. So this was also based on the request from countries on how to deal with the situation, and not meaning how to deal with the difficult situation in producing information, but how to deal with the situation to provide the information that is needed for managing the disasters, how to refocus, for example, a statistical program. And as you know, for example, many countries stopped their censuses in those years because they had to refocus and they had to take into account the difficult situation. And we got feedback from many countries that it was quite useful to have as a reference these recommendations, because it assured them that there is an important place for the NSOs in the institutional environment that has to deal with this new situation, and that there is a need to refocus. So this was a kind of helpful document just to get also kind of a reconfirmation of being on the same page, and also to find a kind of consensus among the colleagues. So to come back to your answer, I cannot tell you how many really use that, but in the case studies that we have collected, we got lots of reference from individual countries in saying that this was quite kind of useful recommendation that the task force was given in this document.
Thank you. I think in the future it will be very helpful for countries to respond to the pandemic-like crisis. And moving on, for Andrew, since you are a scientist, I would like to ask this question. What kind of official statistics do you need for government to provide you, for you to better respond disasters?
Thank you for the question. So I think the best way to address that is there's not necessarily a single answer. You know, on one hand, actually, I'll take a step back. I think when I first started my role as an applied scientist, I would say, you know what I need? I need very high spatial resolution data at very high temporal resolution and everything disaggregated, just very fine grained, everything. And I've grown to see that it's not necessarily the case. And also we need to consider the trade-offs between the resources that go into producing that type of data, maintaining those types of data sets, and also ensuring a level of quality control. And it's the same on the science side. I mean, a lot of my work is also communicating the constraints of climate forecasts, of forecasts and shifts in risk for disaster. So I think there are some similarities there. You know, if we're speaking to data, it's important to understand and communicate, the different levels of quality, different levels of appropriateness, and then also consider the mandates and governance structures, which are equally, if not more important, if we're talking about the bigger picture of integrating data and statistics into real world decision making. So I think what I would say is that to answer that question, I encourage a more structured approach to collaboration with National Statistics Office scientists, academia, because still I think right now scientists are not incentivized to have structured collaboration and dialogue with groups, organizations such as National Statistics Office and other decision makers, or if it happens at the end of the scientific process. So I would encourage more the definition of governance structures to allow for these types of interactions and collaborations could happen at a more substantive level, also early on within the scientific development process. So yeah, I could inform, for example, the algorithm and forecast development with the statistics that are available. And if there is a level of forecast skill that is needed to make a decision, then we can have a discussion of, okay, is it worth the investment, you know, to develop a process to produce statistics that will inform that forecast, and how long will that take? You know, is the historical data available? And is it just a tailoring step, or is this something where we need to look at bigger pictures so that in 2, 5, 10 years, for example, we'll be able to reach that level of skill within the forecasts?
Thank you. Yeah, I think a lot of national statisticians are listening to your answer and will collaborate data. For Mark, there were a lot of lessons you shared with us. One of your takeaway messages is that the data quality is a shared responsibility. And you suggested that the best way to get them interested in is to stimulate them into users of their own data, which is very interesting. Could you share what methods you have used to do so? Is Open Data Program one of them?
So thank you, and thank you for the opportunity to join. I wasn't expecting to be able to be here, so it's nice to be here. The open data program is one of those messages. But basically, it's about trying to get a degree of shared ownership of the community of organisations that contribute data to our integrated data infrastructure, so that they are as dependent on the quality of data from another agency as another agency is on theirs. So it basically tries to get that shared ownership point to encourage agencies to manage their own data, because what we found was that Stats New Zealand, as the holders of the IDI, were having to do a lot of data cleanup ourselves, and so it's how do you shift the responsibility back onto those home agencies. So certainly open data is one of them. Be open and transparent about the quality of the data and expose how good agencies are at data quality to public scrutiny, and that helped get some degree of change. But to be honest, actually, there was a lot about aligning self-interest of if they wanted to work with the data that was in the IDI, they quickly realised that they were as dependent on the next agency as the next agency was dependent on them. So you created this kind of joint incentive to be able to or to encourage them to improve their data quality. We accompany that also. I play a role called Government Chief Data Steward within New Zealand as well, which is managing how all of the agencies that use data in New Zealand, how they work with data, and particularly one of the roles we play is data quality standard setting. So we also, as well as trying to create the incentive for them to improve the quality of the data, we more clearly benchmarked, using that standard setting process, more clearly benchmarked what was expected of them and what those expected standards were. So we were clearer about the standards and created the incentive for them to do it. It's a mixed, I would say it's mixed progress. It's work in progress. Some agencies have really lifted their game. Others have still got a bit to do, and we're working out where next to go with them. So thank you.
Thank you. I have a lot more questions for you, but due to the time. For Anna, I was wondering how do you get those figures from the country? For example, you mentioned that there were 7 million internally displaced people as a result of disaster. So I'm wondering what would be the source of such figures in each country to report to you?
Thank you so much, moderator. The figure that I referred to in my presentation was from the International Center for Displacement Monitoring, the IDMC. So that's not the UNHCR figure. But I'll choose to talk about how we in UNHCR get our population statistics. And this is very much from country level, in collaboration with our UNHCR offices, but also government partners. So it's a collaboration between UNHCR and government partners at country level. And there is a sign of approval from our government partners before this is then moving into our global statistical reporting. So the short answer would be it's a compilation of country statistics that is feeding into a global figure. But we do realize that these statistics has gaps, hence the need for working closely with country partners in building capacity to take this more effectively on. So that's one of the longer term goals of the IGRIS work, but also work that is being taken forward internally in UNHCR, to work with statistical offices, to work with other partners at country level that are key in providing displacement statistics, both on refugee, but also on internally displaced. Maybe also to mention that UNHCR is focusing on displacement as a result of conflict and violence. So that's also important to note. So that's the basis for our statistics. Over to you. Thank you.
Thank you. I asked because I saw the data was not readily available in many countries. Anyway, for Iman, first of all, I want to know the timeline of your one disaster data project, when it will be finished. And also, I wonder why is it called data reference center, not data center? It makes me feel that you might not actually gather data in there. So I'm curious how it is operated.
Okay, thank you, Ms. Kes, for the question. Yeah, this is just the early stage of our development to integrate all the data. The main problem is they do not aware of the importance of the disaster data. They just focus on their own interests. They have the silo governance. That's why the initiative of Indonesia One Disaster Data is really being forced to them that at least the literacy and the awareness rise up to the government agencies. And of course that it involves more government agencies and local governments. For example, at the ministers, the number of ministries and also the government agencies is around 34 to 37 that are involved in this project. And also we involve also the local governments that the number is around 500 something. So it's quite tough to integrate all this data, and we expect that by having 5 years project developments, it can be finish up at least that the 34 government agencies can gather all the data into the what we call the disaster data reference center. So in terms of the name, reference centers means just conceptually that all data being gathered, not only the data physically in the data center, but also all these information related to the metadata, all standard, the concept and definitions, and also how they can interoperate between the data. That's much more important. That's why we call conceptually as the data reference, because everybody can refer the data to this reference. Of course, physically, it will be stored in national data center. I think that's all my answer. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Due to the time, I am asked to finish the session before 5:30 because there's another session. So I would like to wrap up the session now. Thank you, everyone, for presenting and for the very interesting conversation, although it was short. And it was really fun for me to moderate this session, and hope it was a productive time for you as well. Well, thank you, and time to say goodbye. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Goodbye.
Thank you.
Bye-bye. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
This concludes session 2. Special thanks go to Ms. Che and all the panelists for a great session. Without much ado, let me invite you to our next session titled National Experiences from COVID-19, Designing Risk Reduction Measures, Relief Plans, and Recovery. Session 3 consists of a series of pre-recorded video. I will be intervening as necessary, but very briefly, to introduce speakers. So allow me first to direct your attention to our first video, which is from Ms. Francesca Perucci, who chairs this session.
Hello, everyone, and a warm welcome to this third session of the International Conference on the Role of Data and Statistics in Understanding and Mitigating Risks. I'm Francesca Perucci, Assistant Director of the United Nations Statistics Division, and I will moderate the session. The title is National Experiences from COVID-19, Designing Risk and Reduction Measures, Relief Plans, and Fostering Recovery. We will review national experiences from COVID-19 and other crises, and in particular, the role of national statistical systems in addressing and managing the crisis and data-based and science-based COVID-19 policies. We have a lineup of very distinguished experts today for this session, and it is my great pleasure to introduce our first speaker, Mr. Juan Daniel Oviedo, Director General of DANE, the National Statistical Office of Colombia. Juan Daniel Oviedo was appointed Chief Statistician of Colombia in August 2018, after having served as Director of Institutional Planning and Research and Director of the PhD School of Economics. He also holds a permanent academic position at the Universidad del Rosario of Bogota, Colombia. His areas of research include regulation economics, industrial organization, and network economics. Dear Juan Daniel, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Francesca, and I'm very happy to see you again. And let me first thank not only the United Nations Statistical Division, but also COSTAT for organizing this important conference, and more specifically, this conversation that I'm sure that is going to be tremendously important in order to share experiences of how the national statistics systems face the main challenges of the COVID-19 pandemic. From the Colombian perspective, one of the main issues that we wanted to highlight is that the developments of the international statistical community since 2014 were very important in order to allow the Colombian national statistics systems to be a hands-on perspective in the current pandemic. Since 2015, we have been developing and improving the institutional and organizational perspective of our national statistics system that since 2019, we have approached it from a data ecosystem under which the perspectives of the data stewardship approach that has been developed during the last years was appropriated from a coordination perspective of co-production of statistical information from several stakeholders or co-producers of information in our country. Additionally, the institutional framework of our national statistics system not only performs an advisory council, but also puts into practice the data stewardship inside a data stewardship committee that is aligning the production of statistical information from public policy perspective, something that was essential to provide sound answers during the current pandemic of the COVID-19 situation. One dimension that we would like to highlight in this conversation is that related with the challenges and adaptation strategies that we managed to put into practice in order to provide continuity of statistical production in our country. As you may know, Colombia was used to an in-person way of grasping the statistical information, more specifically from the social indicators of our country. Rapidly, the lockdown measures made us accountable of developing new methodologies that were either telephone assistance or internet assistance in order to grasp this important information from the social perspective, more specifically, the labor market indicators that we produce in a monthly way in our country. In that perspective, the institutional framework of the National Statistics Office had a very important change because we need to develop inside the National Statistics Office interdisciplinary groups that we call tiger teams in order to design, implement, and monitor the new developments from the methodological perspective that we were in a very fast way were managed to put into practice in our country in order to provide continuity. But the local way or the local perspective of facing these methodologies was supported from an international network of institutions, for example, the United Nations Statistical Division and the OECD and the Regional Agency for Latin American and Caribbean Countries, ECLAC, that help all statistical offices to feel together as regards us facing these challenges, something that was very important in order to foster some innovation practices, but also a learning community perspective of sharing of our experiences and learning from the advances of neighbors or some leading countries in our region. At the same time, the pandemic was very, very, very effective in accelerating the use and dissemination of statistical production based from administrative records. In the case of Colombia, since 2015, for example, we were looking forward to using the Social Security administrative records and the labor market contributions administrative records in order to better understand the dynamic of the formal perspective of the Colombian labor market, under which the difference between formal and informal labor market is essential to understand in order to see how both sides of our labor market were facing the challenges of the COVID-19 pandemic, more importantly, in the limitation of the well-functioning of our labor market in our country. From an additional perspective, the pandemic was very, very demanding of new sources of information. For example, in our country, people aligned with the international perspective were looking forward for some other indicators, for example, subjective well-being indicators, not only from the household perspective, but also from the business perspective. That's why we needed to develop new statistical operations during the pandemic. And this was very effective in terms of going to the best practices from the international community that was allowed from this strong international network of statistical capabilities that has been deployed during the last years. And we managed, for example, as you might see in the slide, to develop two novel statistical operations. One that is approaching subjective well-being from the household perspective, and another one which is approaching the business well-being or the business sentiments during the pandemic from the entrepreneurial perspective in our country. With these two novel statistical operations, we were able to provide sound answer to this demanding environment of statistical information during the COVID-19 pandemic. At the same time, and as a third issue that we would like to highlight, we were facing challenges in order to better access or to better communicate to our stakeholders. For example, we needed to empower our local authorities in order to take advantage of the disaggregated information that we produce, not only from the social, but also from the economic perspective, in order to foster evidence-based decision frameworks from the subnational perspective in our country. But at the same time, we needed to better align our incentives of co-production of the statistical information or better exchanging administrative records for statistical purposes, for example, with the central bank, some line ministries, subnational agencies in our country, and more importantly, with civil society organizations. At the same time, we needed to diversify our communication strategy because we need to access lockdown dwellings under which they were more exposed to social networks, they were more exposed to internet streamings of our dissemination platforms that more traditionally, we only use broadcasting or radio broadcasting in order to disseminate our results as regards to statistical production. For example, we developed what we call our statistical briefs, that are some narratives that we build up from statistical information that we continuously produce during the pandemic. And for example, in these statistical briefs, we are managing topics which are very, very hot topics, let's say, during the pandemic, as the issue of loneliness, what's happening with mental health, what's happening with migrants or Venezuelan migration profiles in our country, and more specifically from a gender perspective, what's happening with menstrual health management in poverty-exposed women in our country. And at the same time, we needed to approximate or to get closer to the social and economic problems that our population was facing. And that's why the integration between geospatial and statistical information was essential in order to provide granular information that was better aligned not only with the requirements of our stakeholders, but also with the general approach of the Sustainable Development Agenda, and more specifically with the Sustainable Development Goals. In this moment, you are seeing what we call the GIS image viewer of multidimensional poverty in our country. Due to the integration of administrative records and the population and housing census, we managed to develop a per street block multidimensional poverty index that was the keystone in order to go and to develop a COVID-19 vulnerability index that was showing how not only from the socioeconomic perspectives that are addressed in the multidimensional poverty index, but with the health records that from the individual perspective we had access from the Ministry of Health, we managed to develop a vulnerability index that was able to approach the risk of complexities if people in a very specific street block in every municipality in our countries got infected from the coronavirus disease. In these three main issues that we wanted to share with you today, we were looking forward to insist on the fact that the institutional framework and the innovation approach that was fostered from the international statistical community were essential in order to ensure the quality, confidentiality, and professional ethics of statistical production during this current pandemic. At the same time, this had several specific measures from the organization perspective, as the title themes that we were mentioning before, and at the same time, in order to provide sound and granular information, we understood that we could face ethical challenges in the disaggregation of information, and that's why, in a very rapid way, we managed to develop what we call the Colombian Statistical Ethics System, that in Spanish we call Seddon in our country. But more specifically, all this organizational innovation in social and institutional framework made very, very relevant the updating of the legal framework of statistical production in our country. That's why we accelerated the development of a bill of law that was going to update the statistical framework from the legal, institutional, and organizational perspective of official statistics in our country. And taking advantage again of a very leading example of regional cooperation among the statistical offices, in the ECLAC, we managed to develop a generic law of official statistics for Latin American and Caribbean countries that we rapidly adapted to the specificities of the Colombian legislation and the Colombian institutional framework, and we are able to put in a high level of importance the statistical independence of the National Statistics Office of Colombia, and at the same time, how the institutional framework of the national statistics system was going to be functional from the legal perspective, and finally, how we were going to ensure periodical statistical production regarding census, for example, population census every 10 years, economic censuses every 10 years, and the updating of the main sources of statistical production for the national accounting system of our country. That's why we wanted to highlight that institutional frameworks, international capacity development from the statistical perspective, and a risk-prone approach to take advantage of the challenges of the COVID-19 as an innovation catalyzer were very important in Colombia to provide sound answer from the statistical perspective to our society. Thank you very much.
I'd like to thank Mr. Arango for such informative presentation. Next is our second speaker, Mercy Kanyuka, Commissioner of Statistics in Malawi.
Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on wherever you are. My name is Mercy Kanyuka. I am the Commissioner of Statistics in Malawi. I would like to share the Malawi experience from COVID-19, the role of the National Statistical System. The mandate of the National Statistical Office is to produce and coordinate the production of official statistics under the Statistics Act of 2013. We have been adversely affected by the pandemic, especially in the area of data collection. The practice is that we conduct household-based surveys as well as surveys of businesses in the country. And these surveys are usually physical surveys, mostly physical surveys. We do go out to the households with questionnaires. We do go out to the businesses, especially small-scale and medium-scale businesses, with questionnaires to conduct the various surveys. And this has been adversely affected. I remember during the onset of the pandemic, we had teams in the field. One team was conducting multiple indicator cluster survey. We had to recall that team. There was another team conducting integrated household survey. This is a living standard measurement survey. We also had to recall that team. We had 2 other surveys in the field. We had to recall all of them back to the office. Until when we put necessary precautionary measures in place, then we had to redeploy the teams back to the field, and that added costs, additional costs of face masks, additional costs of sanitizers, face masks, not only to the enumerators, but also to the respondents. So we had to add to the budget of the various surveys. Another area where we have also been affected is the dissemination of major results of surveys. We have been in the past conducting national workshops, regional workshops, just to disseminate our data. And it was actually very effective. But now we have to just use online dissemination, and as well as just inviting a few stakeholders and media houses to help us disseminate the information. It is not as effective as it used to be, but we just have to live with the pandemic until when things improve. What have been the service or the role of the National Statistical System? The National Statistical Office offers a supervisory role. We do second officers to various ministries, including Ministry of Health, and we supervise these officers. So the statistics which have been, the Ministry of Health has been releasing on a daily basis are the statistics which are helping the country to monitor the incidence and prevalence of COVID-19 pandemic. So on a daily basis, we get statistics on new cases, statistics on cumulative confirmed cases, statistics on total people who have recovered from the pandemic, statistics on active cases, and even statistics on the recovery rate, statistics on positivity rate, as well as most recently statistics on numbers of people vaccinated. This is very, very useful information which has helped and is continuing to help monitor the progress of the pandemic. And it has been helping to also make decisions on when to relax the preventive measures, as well as even when to reinforce and put back strict precautionary measures, especially in terms of gatherings. The numbers are being limited, or the rules are being relaxed depending on the positivity rate. The positivity rate is the rate which the government is really basing their decisions on, and this has been very, very helpful. The National Statistical Office data provided on poverty also helped to make necessary interventions. The government used the poverty rates of the various cities, the various districts, to target interventions, since most of the households needed to be cushioned on the impact of the COVID-19, especially the poor households in the rural areas as well as the urban areas during the peak of the pandemic. We also had to conduct special COVID-19 surveys as an office. So we conducted, in collaboration with the World Bank, a Malawi high frequency monthly phone survey on knowledge and impact of COVID-19. The survey's aim was to assess the impact of COVID-19 on welfare of households, since the government imposed guidelines and restrictions on movements in the economy. So there were obviously people who were impacted and negatively impacted, and the survey also sought to determine the welfare of the households. There were also some modules which looked at the health, access to health, household amenities, education, employment, and family business. Then there was another parallel survey where we were monitoring on a monthly basis the poverty, as well as feedback on monitoring systems of household well-being. Some questions on the impact of COVID-19 on health and education were also included. But this was a parallel survey which NSO was also involved in with another institution. We have also been helping other research institutions on sampling designs, as well as providing mapping tools and some technical assistance to enable them to conduct specific district-specific, regional-specific surveys, which they sought the technical assistance from NSO, and we were willing to actually assist the various research institutions. We also collaborated with some other research institutions on the COVID-19 impact surveys. So we collaborate with the Catholic Relief Services Resilience Project, which was tracking the impact of COVID-19 on a monthly basis. We also collaborated with the University of Malawi just to look at the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic on the education especially education enrollment. We have had challenges. And the most observed challenge is on the figures which are being released. We get these figures at a national level, and also some figures from district level. So they are disseminated by district. We don't have figures by localities. And these figures by localities would be very useful, because then they would help in targeting. So we know that in the district there are so many people who are ill, others are hospitalized. Okay, when people are hospitalized, then we know where they are. But if these people, the people who are not hospitalized, then they are in their localities, we don't know which locality has got these people. How can we, what is the solution to this? The solution is to link the HMIS data, which is actually capturing these various cases, incidents, and link them to the national IDs, so that we get the information by locality, whether a locality has got some cases or no cases, so that proper targeting can be made. So that's the way, that's how it can be resolved. Another major challenge is limited resources to carry out all the planned surveys for the office. Most of the activities at National Statistical Office, as well as in the line ministries, have stalled because data is not being prioritized. Apart from just cases of COVID-19, but any other data collection instruments, any other data collection activity is not being prioritized anymore. To get the real impact of COVID-19, we need to go out and conduct surveys. We need to go out and collect information. We need to conduct a DHS, so that we are able to get the full impact of the disease. But now with limited resources, that is not possible. We just have to see how we can use mobile surveys as well as online surveys to see how we can conduct these studies. We should also bear in mind that using online surveys, mobile phone surveys, we will be leaving out the hard-to-reach households, where there is no mobile facility, where there is no network. Some households which don't even have the phones, mobile phones, those will probably not be, will have to be left out, and that will be a challenge. We have to see how we can actually go around and be able to address even those, be able to target even those who don't have access to a mobile phone, don't have access to any online channel of data collection. Thank you very much for your attention.
And thank you, Ms. Kanyuka. I would like now to turn over to our third country presentation. This is from Mr. Asaf Yungchun, Director General of Statistics Research Institute, the state-run think tank of official statistics and data innovation in Statistics Korea. Mr. Chan is a journalist turned sociologist with his interdisciplinary research career beginning in 1989 at the University of Michigan. He continued in the interdisciplinary research by working as research chief for decennial directorate at the Census Bureau, and has been a senior survey methodologist at the University of Chicago and many other positions. He has served as program chair of ASI Survey Research Methods section.
Hello, everyone. I'd like to talk about pandemic newscasting to nudge science-based policymaking in Korea. I'm the director of Statistics Research Institute of Statistics Korea. My co-authors of this paper are Paul Choi, Eun Jung, and Euna Kim. I'd like to acknowledge my co-authors, as you can see here, including my colleagues at the University of Toronto and other people in Korea. Basically, I'd like to talk about why we are doing science-based policymaking, and I'd like to talk about three phases of this evidence-based policymaking we are carrying out in South Korea. First, why science-based policymaking? I'd like to remind all of us this paradigm shift towards evidence-based policymaking started in the UK back in 1997. And Prime Minister Tony Blair initiated this evidence-based policymaking on behalf of the people in the UK. President Roh Moo-hyun of South Korea established the system of evidence-based policymaking in 2007. And as you know, President Obama of the United States launched Evidence-Based Policymaking Commission in 2013, followed by a series of institutionalization across the federal government. As you can see in this graph, we used to have pretty much gap between ideology-based national policy and science and democracy-based social progress. And we try to reduce this gap between personal ideology governing a nation and scientific and rational governance that people wish to go after. And evidence-based policymaking is the result of that kind of gap reduction. Again, I'd like to say very briefly, we started this kind of evidence-based policymaking around the issue of the COVID-19 with University of Toronto in Canada. And Prime Minister of Jung Se-kyun of South Korea and Deputy Prime Minister of Canada, Chrystia Freeland, started collaboration over COVID-19. And a lot of things that I'm going to talk about today are based on this collaboration between South Korea and then Canada. Let me briefly talk about the foundations of the data science, especially when it comes to COVID-19 and its prevention. I'll talk about reproduction number very briefly, why we have used the so-called IDEA, and I'm going to talk about evidence-based response to STEM crisis. Assessing reproduction number in COVID-19 pandemic is essential to designing and implementing non-pharmaceutical interventions. I'm not going to talk too much about statistical components of my talk. Basically, reproduction number itself is the function of probability of infection, contact propensity with infected, and the duration of the spread by the infected. And that is what I basically show on this slide. And science-based non-pharmaceutical intervention is essential to controlling the three factors affecting reproduction number. This is the sort of theory behind it. I'm not going to talk about it too much. And this is the main source of the IDEA, so-called exponential, the incidence decay with exponential adjustment model that we have used for building and applying to Korea. Let me talk briefly about dynamic distancing we have used in Korea. When you have this kind of pandemic, and then when you try to use a lot of different kinds of non-pharmaceutical interventions, as you can see on this graph, without the interventions, we are gonna have pretty much high peak of infected cases, as you can see in kind of blue, the shape on this slide. When we have pretty good control of social distancing, masking, and other kinds of non-pharmaceutical interventions, we can control it under the threshold a nation can actually control. And that is what you can see in this wave-like sort of pattern when you have those things well under control. We have used this SIR-based modeling and experience to stem this crisis in Korea. And I like to say this academic modeling is science and art, because we have to use this model-based methodology in a lot of different situations in Korea. And basically it is to reduce uncertainty. And eventually we like to do newscasting to carry out evidence-based policymaking. In the case of Korea, we started laws after the MERS outbreak back in 2015. And we have continued a lot of advancement of smart quarantine info system. In 2017, we created big data system for precision tracing in 2020. And then based on all this kind of legal foundation, we are able to locate data shared with the public evolutionarily with a higher level of privacy. And that's what I show on this slide. Let me illustrate a few points here. to show how this the idea-based modeling actually started. Back in March last year, we initially started this idea-based modeling to focus about 11,000 cases by the end of the March. And that's what you see on this model. Based on this limited number of the infected cases, we could actually come up with what could happen after a month or 2 months later. And actually, when we compared this model-based cases with actual data, they are pretty consistent. We also try to measure this reproduction number over time so we can see how things are happening. And as you can see here, this reproduction number has declined over about 2 months from February and then March back in 2020. And we also try to see whether this kind of modeling is going to work in the local area in southern region of South Korea. So what you see here is that based on this particular cases with very, I think, a limited time frame, we're able to model and show how it is going to actually decline over time. And usually, I think in the past, we could say when we have very important intervention, its effect usually happened about 2 weeks later. And that's what you see here. When we had this peak of infected cases, if the intervention worked pretty well, it actually had its effect after 2 weeks later. What could have happened if we didn't have any good sort of non-pharmaceutical interventions? And this is very important information that I think the policymakers like to know about. So we actually try to model what could happen without the intervention and with intervention. So here, back in 2020, sometimes last, the March and April time period, and we had pretty strong interventions in a national scale. And if we didn't have those kind of interventions, this slide actually shows we could have over 3.4 million infected cases by the fall of 2020. That did not happen because Korea was able to control things with pretty good series of non-pharmaceutical interventions I just talked about. This is another sort of, I think the illustration to show you how this model, I think they were created again and again over time, and to show how the cases will be declining over time and when it is going to reach the peak. This is another modeling to illustrate how we actually created actual pattern in one of the local areas. Like I said, we keep trying to measure reproduction number over time. This is very critical information we need to have under our radar. Again, this is another modeling we did June last year to see how we can control this, another wave, second wave of the pandemic in Korea. And we were able to come up with pretty nice model based on very limited data. And then we came up with pretty good interventions. One thing I'd like to tell you about this is that when we had the modeling and also some kind of pretty good system of interventions, how we could confirm it. Statistics Korea and NSK actually partnered together to do some kind of big data analysis based on mobility of handphones, so we can estimate mobility flows. This is actually to confirm whether people moved in response to these interventions we created, so we have pretty good social distancing. So we could confirm whether the model is going to work or not based on actual mobility people actually showed in response to the governmental interventions. And as you can see here, we have pretty good pattern of how Korean people were in compliance with this mandated social distancing over different time period. I like to say over time, we continued adapting this modeling to different needs. So initially we started with this SIL-based idea model, but we had some other variants. So we can handle this crisis better and then come up with a better estimation and prediction, and then do pretty good evidence-based policymaking. So we had SEIR model, SEIQR model. Also, we had data simulation, and also we have segmented Poisson model with policy variables. These are all different variants of the SIR model we have used. This is one of the examples I can point out. In the back in, I think, the middle of last year, we had also another test and then modeling, and it worked pretty well. And this is another illustration we did, back in December 2020, and then showing what kind of predictions that we had, and then actually the data followed pretty well. And another example, I don't have time to explain all the details. So what is the next phase? I'd like to say 3 things in conclusion. We continue to have evidence policymakers in place. When you have good statisticians, data scientists, and other scientists, if you do not have the policymakers in place who do well understand evidence-based policymaking, I think all this prediction may be useless. And Korea was very good to have good leaders in place. I like to say we need blue data designers in the future. What do I mean by that? We have a data lake to store the data. We have data mountain to keep archiving good quality data. We need to have the data ocean to share a lot of data. And I call all those assembled together as blue data. And we need to harness multiple sources of data and data linking so we can have pretty good blue data system to stem the future pandemic crisis that might be hitting the planet again and again. We also need AI and data science-based series. I think that we are just part of this so-called AI data science-based series. We need to have more people well-trained, well-prepared, and all these people need to be partnered together across the continents so we can be better prepared for the future pandemic. Probably I don't have time to go over some other slides that I have, but I think what I just mentioned is the end of my talk. And I just like to share with you this good painting by John Miller. It's titled The Seers. He painted this thing back in 1971, and when he looked up the heaven in Spain, and then he tried to actually see the future based on his painting and conceptualized in this series. Today, we have a lot of data scientists, good statisticians, good policymakers. If we can work together, we can see we can see the future better with all this good data and an AI-based tool. And so we are all the seers. And I'd like to ask many of you to join this group of the seers to handle the future crisis better. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chan, for the very interesting presentation. I'd like now to turn to our colleagues from the Office for National Statistics in the UK. We have a joint presentation by Ms. Esther Sutherland and Ms. Ruth Studley. Ms. Esther Sutherland is Head of Strategic Development for the COVID-19 Infection Survey. She's responsible for stakeholder management, collecting user requirements, briefing and reporting, and delivering on other strategic analytical developments across the division. She has also worked on the 2021 census, social survey data collection, the race disparity unit, and within the National Statistician's Private Office. Ruth Studley joined ONS in June 2020 and has a number of years' experience leading multidisciplinary teams working on health statistics and research. Additionally, she has led various health policy and health regulatory roles. Ruth has a particular interest in producing statistics and intelligence to inform decision making. Dear colleagues, you have the floor. Over to you.
Hi, my name's Esther and I'm from the Office for National Statistics here in the UK. I'm Head of Strategic Development for the COVID-19 Infection Survey, which I'll tell you more about soon. Today in this presentation, I'm going to talk to you about some of the health statistics we have produced in response to the pandemic. ONS has a long-standing role in reporting statistics on health from admin data and survey data. Our analysis is widely used for public policy decision-making. From March 2020, the country turned to ONS's reporting of deaths to understanding the pandemic, as well as evidence to support government decision-making from our social and business surveys, public policy analysis, and economic statistics. As our offer expanded to support in government decision-making, we increased the data we collected and the analysis we produced. We introduced the Health Analysis and Pandemic Insights Directorate to bring together the health and pandemic-related analysis we produced. So firstly, let's look at some of our data sources. In England, deaths are legally required to be registered by the local registration service in partnership with the General Register Office. Coding for cause of death is carried out according to the World Health Organization definitions. There are various layers of verification of death certificates, and sometimes deaths are referred to the coroners. We receive this data and produce and publish analysis from it. Moving on to the COVID-19 infection survey. Given the weight of the pandemic, there was a need for a new community-based survey to be set up to understand the levels of COVID-19 in the population. ONS responded to this requirement through collaboration between the private sector and charitable organisations, including IQVIA, NatSen and Ipsos Mori, working with the UK Biocentre and University of Oxford to collect and process swab and blood samples. The COVID-19 infection survey is a large-scale longitudinal household survey. The sample is drawn from our address base at random and so is representative of the country by age, sex and region. By community in this instance, we mean those in private residential households as opposed to settings such as hospitals. At the start of the pilot stage of the study, we invited around 20,000 households in England to take part, anticipating this would result in roughly 21,000 individuals from around 10,000 households participating. Since the end of July, we have further expanded the survey and now have over 150,000 households across the UK taking part, totalling over 400,000 individual participants aged 2 and over. Our devolved administrations also decided to participate in the survey, and so we began data collection in Wales in June 2020, in Northern Ireland in July 2020, and in Scotland in September 2020. Participants are asked to provide a swab test once a week for the first 5 weeks they are in the study, and then once a month thereafter. This swab allows us to test if the individuals are currently infected with COVID-19. This allows us to provide both a positivity rate, which is the number of people with COVID-19 at a point in time, and an incidence estimate, which is the number of new infections. A large proportion of participants aged 16 and over are also invited to provide a blood sample through a capillary blood test. We use these blood samples to test for level of COVID-19 antibodies. We also collect data which tracks demographic and behavioural information, such as where someone lives, where they are working, and how they might be travelling to work. And we use these data to produce modelled estimates of the numbers of people likely to test positive in the UK. Crucially, as our survey doesn't rely on people coming forward for testing, we can more accurately capture things like asymptomatic infections. The final source of data I want to talk about today is our schools infection survey. The Schools Infection Survey investigates the role of schools in COVID-19 transmission and how transmission within and from school settings can be minimised. A random sample of schools in England were asked to take part in COVID-19 testing as part of the study to find out how many school pupils and staff have had the infection, how many have developed antibodies against the virus, and how this changes over the course of the year. The study is conducted by Public Health England in partnership with the Office for National Statistics and the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine. 150 schools, 50 from primary and 100 from secondary, are participating in the study. In primary schools, the average enrolment is 280 pupils, and in secondary schools is 990 pupils in 2 consecutive year groups. The study oversampled schools in high-risk areas of the country. 10 local authorities were taken from this group and 5 from the remaining local authorities. Repeat surveys and testing every half-term were carried out to collect risk factor information with virus and antibody samples in a cohort of pupils and staff throughout the academic year. So as I said earlier, data from these various sources have been used throughout the pandemic to understand what was happening at the single points in time and help to inform specific policy interventions that the government defined. So now I'll talk you through some of those pieces of analysis we have produced that the government have been able to use. From the COVID-19 infection survey, we produced modelled estimates to understand trends in positivity for all 4 UK nations. After the first national lockdown, the government introduced a local approach to interventions, including different tiers of interventions. We produced regional analysis throughout the summer to give an indication of the levels of positivity in the regions of England and how they may be changing. Around October time, as I said, we increased our sample. We also then had sufficient enough numbers in order to produce sub-regional estimates. And this allowed us to demonstrate to policymakers a further detailed breakdown to identify areas of concerns for this tiered and regional approach to policymaking. In December 2020, the emergence of a new UK variant of the virus was spreading. As the infection survey has a representative sample in the community population, our data was vital in understanding the prevalence of this new variant. The new variant of COVID-19 was found to have genetic changes in the S gene, and this meant the S gene was no longer detected in the existing COVID test. Our analysis of these gene patterns of positivity identified that through November and December, there had been an increase in the percentage of positive cases where the S gene had dropped out. This analysis was the primary source of evidence to support the government introducing a Tier 4 stricter intervention over the Christmas period for parts of England. Across the pandemic, we have also looked at various situations that might change an individual's risk to getting COVID-19. For example, we looked at travel to work and found that those who travelled to work were more likely to test positive for COVID-19 than those working from home. Equally, those who found it more difficult to maintain social distancing in their workplace were more likely to test positive as well. So as I mentioned, we did already produce deaths analysis before the pandemic. However, we've undertaken lots of different pieces of work to expand upon this analysis, which I'll talk through now. Before the pandemic, we released weekly data of the number of deaths in England and Wales, including breakdowns by sex, age and region of England. During the pandemic, we increased our analysis to include analysis on deaths involving COVID-19, which included age standardised mortality rates and deaths involving COVID-19 by local areas. We also produced analysis on COVID-19 mortality by ethnicity, religion, disability status and occupation through linking mortality records to the 2011 census. Finally, we produced analysis on excess mortality that was not due to COVID-19. We were able to significantly increase the amount of mortality data we were able to produce on COVID-19 as a result of data linkage, for example, to the public health data asset and to the census 2011. For example, from producing analysis on this linked data, we were able to find that large ethnic inequalities in COVID-19 related to mortality. We found some of this inequality could be explained by socio-economic conditions and pre-pandemic health, but not all. We also found changes in the differences between the various waves of COVID-19 in the country. This chart shows the evidence that we found all ethnic minority groups were at an elevated risk of COVID-19 related death in Wave 1. And this chart shows that in Wave 2, the risk remained elevated for South Asians, but less so for other ethnic minority groups. The final analysis I want to briefly cover is that produced from the schools infection survey. As mentioned, from the schools infection survey, we were able to look at rates in schools within pupils and staff. So on the left, we have the percentage of primary and secondary school pupils testing positive for COVID-19 across the various rounds of the study. And on the right, we have the same but for staff. There are various lessons we have learned in the Health Analysis and Pandemic Insight Directorate over the course of the pandemic. Some of this is around how we communicate complex technical information. Some of it is around how we ensure that our data is of high quality as well as accessible, and that we meet the needs of varying users, not just government decision makers, but also the general public, the media and academics. We've really benefited from the ability to partner with academics that have really improved the analysis we've been able to produce. And also that we have been able to upskill our workforce in order to continue to meet the demands of the pandemic. Thank you for taking the time to listen to this presentation, and please feel free to get in touch if you have any additional questions.
Thank you very much. We've now heard from national statistical offices how they have addressed the many challenges of the pandemic and the key role they have played in national efforts to address and mitigate the impact of the crisis. It is now my pleasure to introduce Ms. Mark Hereward, Associate Director for Data and Analytics at UNICEF, who will talk about data preparedness in countries in situation of conflict and vulnerability, countries where UNICEF has been working and providing support to governments. Mr. Mark Hereward has been Associate Director for Data and Analytics at UNICEF, where he leads the team that collects, assesses, analyzes, stores and makes public data and statistics on the situation of children and women. He joined UNICEF in 1995 in the statistics section at headquarters, UNICEF headquarters in New York, subsequently moving to UNICEF China, and then over to UNICEF Regional Office for East Asia and the Pacific in Bangkok as Regional Planning Officer. Dear Mark, you have the floor. Over to you.
Good day to everybody who is joining this international conference on the use of big data in official statistics, my favorite meeting of the year. Whether it's good morning, good afternoon, or good night, I just want to express how privileged I am to be able to share some thoughts with you today. Of course, we're all looking to see how we can learn from this long drawn out massive emergency that the COVID pandemic has brought along. And it has affected every part of our lives. And of course, the national statistical systems are not immune to COVID, just like anything else. And this particular session, we're looking to see what lessons we can learn in terms of building resilient data and statistical systems. And one element of that I want to argue today is the whole concept of data preparedness. This is the data equivalent of pre-positioning of supplies, of having emergency plans ready in place for different scenarios. In the same way, we need to be prepared with the data and statistics for when, and it's always when, not if, different kinds of disasters can strike. I'm going to be using a non-COVID example to illustrate, but of course the principles apply throughout. So I have a colleague who went to Sudan, in fact to Darfur in Sudan for a 3-month assignment recently. She just came back. And we had asked her to go there to see how to make into practice these ideas that we had on data preparedness, but also on what we call data savvy, which is the confidence and comfort with using data, and of course the competence and commitment to using data, which we also argue is essential to data making a difference for children, for people in general. So what I'm showing on this slide is a map that she made. And what's amazing really is that this was the first time, when she put this map together, it was the first time that government or UNICEF saw these data all in one place. The data existed. They were from different surveys by government and by the UN system and a couple by NGOs, but they had never been put together in one place with an operational overview to be able to answer operational questions to be able to make a difference. So the questions were simply, where are the most vulnerable children and what services do they have? And the first lesson you draw from it really is, of course, that more data are available than we know. But data is just one of the building blocks necessary to using data to make a difference. So if the four building blocks are data and talent and technology and funding, data availability is important, and the data availability to be able to answer the questions that are needed. But also there's the data savvy, the talent is the data savvy concept that I was talking about before, and the technology to put all these data together in a way that they can and will be used. But we need all these in place, and of course the funding to be able to make them be in place for the data to start making a difference. And beyond that map, our colleague then went into creating what she called the data pocketbook, which is like a dashboard really to answer the question, are we doing the right thing in the right place for maximum impact, in this case for children? And it's based on the premise that what's needed are fast feedback loops. Feedback both on how the situation is changing and feedback on how the programmatic impact is happening because of the interventions from government and others. And it's with those fast feedback loops, which come across the whole of the national statistical system, that we can then be sure that what we're doing is having the maximum impact, because we never have enough resources to be able to have the impact we need. So we need to make sure that we're targeting it most precisely for the maximum effect. And I just want to reiterate that the demand for data is as important as the supply of data. The systems are necessary, but not sufficient condition, the economists would say, to be able to make a difference, for the data to be able to make a difference. And overall, from this exercise, we bring a main conclusion, which is that a no regrets approach to data preparedness is really essential. It's what I think the Americans would call a no-brainer. Preparedness in general, it makes things more efficient, and data preparedness must be the same. An evaluation by DFID, as it was then, on the emergency response of UNICEF and World Food Programme concluded that $1 of preparedness saved $7 of operational expenses when an emergency did hit. I'm sure that same kind of ratio would apply to data preparedness as it would to the other kinds of preparedness that they were looking at. And what does that preparedness mean? It means having a common operational data set, common between the national statistics offices and the ministries, to know the number and position of the population of concern, and the extent and the geographic distribution of service provision before a disaster happens, so that we have a baseline, and so that we can look at the extent of service disruption and a population movement to see how services need to be recalibrated to be able to have the maximum impact to reach those who need it most. We can assess the disruption, we can do our monitoring, we can do our evaluation, the whole time looking both at the statistical data on the situation and on the operational data on what is being done to help those people, all with geospatial analysis to be able to make sure that we make the biggest impact possible. So that's my plea for data preparedness. I absolutely believe in it fully, and I would look forward to seeing how we could use big data, rapid surveys, statistical data, all the different sources to bring together so that we're ready when a disaster happens and we can be the most effective in reaching those who need us most. Thanks very much.
Thank you so much, Mark, for the very, very interesting presentation. This concludes the interventions by our panelists. From what we heard today, I think it is evident the national statistical offices have played a key role in the response by governments to the pandemic. And in general, their contribution to responding to disasters is critical. It is also important to note that those countries where the process of transformation and modernization of the data and statistical systems was well underway, like in the case of Colombia, were able to quickly adapt to the new circumstances and to even accelerate their journey to innovation. We've also heard about the critical importance of data preparedness, being ready with the key data sets from all different data sources that can support the immediate response when the disaster hits. We'll have an opportunity to further reflect on many of the important points that were raised today by our panelists, both in the rest of the sessions during the conference, but also at the round table on our third day, when we will sort of summarize and reflect on the various lessons learned and the experiences shared by all our participants. For now, let me thank the speakers once again for their incredible contributions, and thank to the audience for their attention. And I wish you all a very good rest of the day wherever you are. Thank you so much.
We hope you enjoy this session on national experience from COVID-19. This concludes all the session in day 1 of the International Conference on Official Statistics. I'd like to thank all of the session chairs and the speakers for sharing their insights, and thank our participants for joining us today. The conference will resume tomorrow at the same time as today, that is 8:30 a.m. in Seoul, 1:30 a.m. in Geneva, and 7:30 p.m. on August 31st in New York. We look forward to seeing you. Thank you all.